In the quiet cathedral city of Gloucester, England, behind the ordinary facade of a terraced house on Cromwell Street, one of Britain's most horrifying criminal cases was unfolding. Between 1967 and 1987, Fred and Rose West committed at least 12 murders, transforming their family home into what the press would later call the House of Horrors. Fred West, born in 1941, was a builder and handyman. Rose West, born in 1953, became his second wife in 1972. Together, they created a nightmare that would span 2 decades, claiming the lives of young women and girls, including members of their own family. Their crimes involved sexual abuse, torture, dismemberment, and burial beneath their home and garden. This is the story of how 2 damaged individuals found each other, and how their union created something far more monstrous than either might have been alone. Fred West's early life. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29, 1941, in Muchmarcle, a small village in Herefordshire, England. He was the second of 6 children born to Walter and Daisy West, a working-class farming family. Fred's childhood was marked by poverty and dysfunction. His father worked as a farm laborer and disciplinarian who ruled the household with an iron fist. According to Fred's later claims, though these remain unverified, his family environment was one where sexual boundaries were routinely violated. He alleged that his father had told him it was normal for fathers to initiate their daughters into sex, and that incest was acceptable within the family unit. Whether these claims were true or fabricated to justify his own behavior remains debated by criminologists. What is documented is that Fred was of below-average intelligence, struggled in school, and left formal education at age 15 with minimal qualifications. At age 17 in 1958, Fred suffered a serious motorcycle accident that left him in a coma for a week. He sustained a significant head injury, and friends later reported that his personality changed after this incident. He became more aggressive, prone to violent outbursts, and developed an insatiable sexual appetite. A year later, at 18, another motorcycle accident resulted in a fractured skull and a broken leg. Some experts have theorized that these brain injuries may have damaged his impulse control and contributed to his violent tendencies. By his late teens, Fred had developed a pattern of sexual offending. In November 1961, at age 20, he was accused of getting a 13-year-old girl pregnant, a friend of his younger sister. He appeared before a local magistrate but escaped serious punishment when the girl's family declined to press charges. However, Fred's family reportedly banished him from the household after this incident. In 1962, Fred married Rena Costello, a Scottish woman with a troubled background who was already pregnant with another man's child. He moved to Scotland with her, where their relationship was marked by violence, prostitution, and criminal activity. During this period, Fred worked various jobs as a laborer and ice cream van driver, positions that gave him access to vulnerable young women. Rose West's early life. Rosemary Pauline Letts was born on November 29, 1953, in Barnstaple, Devon. She was the 5th of 7 children born to Bill and Daisy Letts, and her childhood was arguably even more troubled than Fred's. Her father, Bill Letts, was a schizophrenic war veteran who suffered from severe mental illness. He was reportedly violent, controlling, and sexually inappropriate with his children. Rose's mother, Daisy, suffered from severe depression and underwent electroconvulsive therapy while pregnant with Rose, a treatment that some have speculated may have affected Rose's development, though this remains unproven. The Letts household was characterized by extreme dysfunction. Bill Letts was a tyrant who enforced strict rules, administered brutal punishments, and created an atmosphere of fear. Daisy eventually left him in 1959 when Rose was just 5 years old, taking the children with her. However, Bill gained custody of Rose and some of her siblings through the courts, and Rose returned to live with her father. From an early age, Rose displayed concerning behaviors. She was described as overweight, socially awkward, and subject to violent mood swings. Teachers noted that she would rock violently in her chair and had difficulty controlling her temper. By her early teens, Rose had developed an unusually intense interest in sex. She was known to make sexual advances toward boys and men, behavior that was particularly pronounced and inappropriate for her age. Some accounts suggest she may have been sexually abused by her father or other male relatives, though this was never conclusively proven. Rose left school at age 15 with no qualifications and began working as a cleaner and in other menial jobs. She was just 15 years old, still a child herself, when she would meet the man who would become her partner in murder. How Fred and Rose met. In 1969, Fred West was 27 years old, married to his first wife Rena, and already a father. Rose Letts was just 15, a vulnerable, troubled teenager looking for escape from her oppressive home life. They met at a bus stop in Cheltenham in the autumn of 1969. Fred was working as an ice cream van driver and general laborer. He was immediately attracted to the young Rose, and despite the significant age gap and the fact that he was married, he began pursuing her aggressively. Fred was a practiced manipulator. He showered Rose with attention and affection that she had never received at home. For Rose, Fred represented freedom, excitement, and someone who accepted her intense sexuality without judgment. For Fred, Rose was young, controllable, and shared his increasingly deviant sexual appetites. By late 1969, when Rose was just 16, she moved in with Fred. She took on the role of caring for his two daughters from his marriage to Rena, Charmaine, who was Rena's daughter from a previous relationship, and Anna Marie, Fred's biological daughter. Rose quickly became pregnant with Fred's child, giving birth to their daughter Heather in October 1970, when Rose was still only 16 years old. It was during this period that the couple's relationship took an even darker turn. Fred introduced Rose to increasingly violent sexual practices, and she proved not just willing but enthusiastic. Fred would later claim that Rose had an insatiable sexual appetite and enjoyed violence. The couple began inviting young women to their home for sexual encounters, often involving bondage and sadism. Fred worked as Rose's pimp, advertising her services to other men while he watched or participated. This pattern of joint sexual violence and exploitation would become the template for their murders. First murder. In mid-1971, while Fred was serving a short prison sentence for theft and unpaid fines, 8-year-old Charmaine disappeared from the household. Rose was alone with the children at the time. Charmaine was never seen again. When Fred was released from prison, he told neighbors that Rena had come to collect Charmaine and taken her away. In reality, Charmaine had been murdered, most likely by Rose, and Fred had helped dispose of the body, burying her beneath the kitchen floor of their home at Midland Road. In August 1971, Rena West, Fred's first wife, came to Gloucester looking for Charmaine. She too disappeared and was never seen alive again. Fred murdered her, strangled her, and buried her body in a field. Fred and Rose married on January 29, 1972, at Gloucester Registry Office. Rose was 18 years old. The marriage certificate was signed just months after Fred had murdered his first wife, a fact that would not be discovered for more than 2 decades. Timeline of their crimes. Between 1971 and 1987, Fred and Rose West murdered at least 12 young women and girls. Many of the victims were lodgers, hitchhikers, or vulnerable young women who were lured to their home with offers of accommodation or work. The true number of victims may never be known. 1971. First known victims. Charmaine West, approximately 8 years old. Stepdaughter, daughter of Rena Costello. Disappeared in June/July 1971 while Fred was in prison. Most likely killed by Rose. Her remains were found buried beneath the kitchen of 25 Midland Road in 1994. She had been dismembered. Rena Costello, née West, age 27. Fred's first wife. Murdered in August 1971 by Fred when she came looking for Charmaine. Her dismembered body was buried in Letterbox Field near Muchmarcle, Herefordshire. 1972. The move to Cromwell Street. In the autumn of 1972, the West family moved to 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester, a large, 3-story terraced house that would become the primary location of their crimes. They rented rooms to lodgers, mostly young women, giving them constant access to potential victims. Anna Marie West, Fred's daughter, born 1964. In 1972, when she was approximately 8 years old, Fred began sexually abusing her. The abuse continued throughout her childhood and teenage years. Rose participated in the abuse. Anna Marie survived and would later testify against Rose. 1973. Lynda Gough, age 19, a seamstress and former lodger at Cromwell Street. She disappeared in April 1973. She was sexually assaulted, murdered, and dismembered. Her body was buried in an inspection pit beneath the garage floor at 25 Cromwell Street. Fred removed her kneecaps and certain other bones, a signature mutilation he would repeat with later victims. 1974. Carol and Cooper, age 15. A schoolgirl from Worcester who was abducted on November 10, 1973, body found relating to 1974 period. While making her way home from a cinema, she was held captive, sexually tortured, murdered, and buried beneath the cellar at Cromwell Street. Her body showed evidence of having been bound and gagged. Lucy Partington, age 21. A university student who disappeared on December 27, 1973, while waiting for a bus to return home after visiting a friend in Cheltenham. She was the cousin of novelist Martin Amis. Lucy was held captive, tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Her dismembered body was found beneath the cellar at Cromwell Street. Fred had removed several bones, including fingers and toes. 1975. Therese Siegenthaler, age 21, a Swiss sociology student hitchhiking through England. She disappeared in April 1974, discovered in investigations related to 1975. Her body was found buried in the cellar at Cromwell Street. Like other victims, she had been dismembered and certain bones were missing. Shirley Hubbard, age 15, a schoolgirl and shop worker from Droitwich who disappeared on November 14, 1974, while hitchhiking to her boyfriend's house. Her body was found in the cellar at Cromwell Street. Evidence suggested she had been kept alive for several days and subjected to prolonged torture, including being bound with elaborate bondage equipment. Her head had been completely wrapped in tape, with only a plastic tube inserted through the nose to allow breathing. 1977. Juanita Mott, age 18, a former lodger at Cromwell Street who disappeared in April 1975. Body discovery related to later period. Her remains were found in the cellar. She had been bound, gagged, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Her body showed similar patterns of dismemberment and bone removal. Shirley and Robinson, age 18, a lodger at Cromwell Street who was pregnant with Fred's child when she disappeared in May 1978. She had been involved in the West's sexual activities and had developed a relationship with both Fred and Rose. When she became possessive of Fred, Rose reportedly decided she had to go. Her body and that of her unborn child were buried in the garden at Cromwell Street. 1979. Alison Chambers, age 16, some sources state 17, a troubled teenager who had spent time in care. She disappeared in August or September 1979. Her body was found buried in the garden at Cromwell Street. She too had been sexually assaulted, murdered, and dismembered. 1987. The final known victim, Heather West, age 16. Fred and Rose's first child together, born in 1970. Heather had endured years of sexual abuse from her father. In June 1987, when she was 16, she disappeared. Fred and Rose told people she had left home or had been picked up by a lesbian biker gang. In reality, Heather had threatened to tell police about the abuse. Fred strangled her, and her body was buried in the garden at 25 Cromwell Street, near Shirley Robinson and Alison Chambers. Her murder would ultimately lead to the couple's downfall. Methods and patterns. The West's methods were chillingly consistent. They targeted vulnerable young women, runaways, hitchhikers, girls from troubled backgrounds who might not be immediately missed. They would lure victims to 25 Cromwell Street with offers of lodging, work, or simply a lift. Once inside the house, victims were imprisoned, usually in the cellar. They were subjected to prolonged sexual torture, often involving elaborate bondage equipment, gags, and masks. Both Fred and Rose participated in the assaults. The victims were eventually murdered, usually by strangulation or suffocation, and then dismembered. Fred, with his building experience, would methodically butcher the bodies, often removing specific bones as trophies. The remains were buried beneath the cellar floor, in the garage inspection pit, or in the garden. Fred used his skills as a builder to conceal the evidence, installing false floors and walls, and constantly modifying the house to hide burial sites. The house at 25 Cromwell Street became a literal tomb, with bodies buried layer upon layer beneath the floors and garden. Throughout these years, the Wests maintained a facade of normalcy. Rose continued to work as a prostitute, seeing clients in specially designated rooms at Cromwell Street, while Fred acted as her minder. They raised 8 children in the house, though several of these children were subjected to horrific sexual abuse. The older children were forced to participate in the couple's sexual activities or made to watch. Neighbors described Fred as friendly and talkative, always working on the house. Rose was seen as more reclusive but not notably suspicious. The true horror occurring within the walls of 25 Cromwell Street remained hidden for nearly 2 decades. How the investigators caught them. The unraveling of Fred and Rose West's crimes began not with detective work or forensic breakthrough, but with the courage of their own children. August 1992. The first investigation. In August 1992, one of the younger West children made an allegation at school that she had been raped by Fred. The Child Protection Services and police became involved. During the investigation, another child disclosed that Heather, Fred and Rose's eldest daughter, who had supposedly left home in 1987, had been murdered by her parents. Police searched 25 Cromwell Street but found nothing. The case was complex, and prosecutors felt there was insufficient evidence to proceed with murder charges. However, Fred was charged with multiple counts of rape and sexual abuse of minors. Rose was also charged with sexual abuse. Both Fred and Rose were released on bail, but the rape charges were eventually dropped when key witnesses, including the children, refused to testify. The children had been intimidated and were terrified of their parents. The case collapsed in June 1993. The missing daughter. However, Detective Constable Hazel Savage of Gloucestershire Police did not forget. She had been part of the investigation team and was deeply troubled by the allegation that Heather West had been murdered. The official story that Heather had run away had never made sense. Heather had left behind no trace, had never claimed benefits, had never contacted siblings or friends. DC Savage quietly continued to investigate. She searched for any record of Heather West, employment records, benefit claims, medical records, anything that would prove she was alive. She found nothing. February 1994. The search warrant. On February 24, 1994, armed with sufficient concerns, DC Savage and her colleagues obtained a search warrant for 25 Cromwell Street, specifically to look for the remains of Heather West. The next day, February 25, 1994, police arrived at Cromwell Street with ground-penetrating radar and began searching the garden. Fred West was present and appeared cooperative, even making jokes. Rose was defiant and hostile. The discovery. On February 26, 1994, police began excavating the garden. Almost immediately, they found human remains. The bones were those of a young female who had been dismembered. Fred initially tried to claim it was Heather, and that her death had been an accident. But as excavation continued over the following days, more remains were found. Then more. The garden contained 3 sets of human remains. On February 27th, Fred West was arrested on suspicion of murder. Rose was arrested the following day. The House of Horrors revealed. Realizing the scale of what they were dealing with, police expanded their search to the interior of 25 Cromwell Street. Using architectural plans and Fred's history of constantly modifying the house, they began systematically excavating beneath the floors. The cellar yielded body after body. The bathroom, the garage, By March 1994, police had found 9 sets of remains at Cromwell Street alone. Fred West initially denied everything, then began confessing, but only to crimes he committed alone, attempting to exonerate Rose. He claimed Rose knew nothing, that all the murders were his work alone. Investigators didn't believe him. Fred's confessions. Fred eventually led police to additional burial sites. At the previous address, 25 Midland Road, they found Charmaine's remains. At Letterbox Field in Muchmarkel, they found Rena's body and that of Anna McFall, another early victim from 1967 whom Fred had murdered before he even met Rose. Fred gave detailed confessions, describing the murders with chilling matter-of-factness. He seemed almost proud of his ability to evade detection for so long. However, he insisted throughout that Rose was innocent, a claim that investigators, prosecutors, and ultimately a jury would reject. Rose's defense. Rose West maintained complete innocence. She claimed she had no knowledge of any murders, that Fred had acted alone, and that she was a victim of his manipulation and violence. She portrayed herself as a battered wife who had been too frightened to question her husband's activities. However, evidence contradicted this defense. Witnesses described Rose as a willing and enthusiastic participant in sexual violence. The pattern of abuse against the children showed Rose's active involvement. Most significantly, Charmaine West had been murdered while Fred was in prison, making it impossible for him to have acted alone. Trial and sentencing. Fred and Rose West were charged with 12 counts of murder. The case against them was overwhelming, but the prosecution faced one significant problem. Fred West would never stand trial. January 1, 1995, Fred West's suicide. On New Year's Day, 1995, while on remand at HM Prison Birmingham, Winson Green, Fred West hanged himself in his cell using strips of bedsheet. He was 53 years old. Fred left several letters, including one to Rose, in which he professed his love for her and continued to insist she was innocent. Some interpreted this as a final act of manipulation. Others saw it as genuine devotion. His suicide meant that many questions would remain forever unanswered. How many victims were there really? Were there other burial sites? What happened to other missing women who had been associated with the Wests? Fred's body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea to prevent his grave becoming a macabre tourist attraction. October 3, 1995, Rose West's trial begins. Rose West's trial began at Winchester Crown Court on October 3, 1995, before Mr. Justice Mantell. She faced 10 counts of murder. Charmaine West and Rena Costello were excluded from the charges as Fred was believed to have been the principal actor in those deaths, and evidence of Rose's involvement was insufficient for prosecution. The prosecution, led by Brian Levison QC, later Lord Justice Levison, presented a comprehensive case built on forensic evidence from the burial sites, testimony from surviving victims, including Anna Marie West, who described the systematic sexual abuse, testimony from former lodgers who described Rose's active participation in violence, evidence that Charmaine had been murdered while Fred was in prison, proving Rose's capability for murder, the pattern of joint enterprise in sexual violence that made Rose an equal partner. Rose's defense. Rose's defense team, led by Richard Ferguson QC, argued that Rose was a victim of Fred's manipulation and control, as she had been subjected to domestic violence and lived in fear. Fred was a practiced liar who had manipulated others into believing Rose was involved. There was no direct forensic evidence linking Rose to the murders. The circumstantial nature of the evidence did not prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Rose West did not testify in her own defense, a decision that prosecutors suggested showed consciousness of guilt. November 22, 1995, the verdict. After a trial lasting 7 weeks, the jury deliberated for just over 4 hours. On November 22, 1995, Rose West was found guilty on all 10 counts of murder. Mr. Justice Mantell sentenced her to life imprisonment on each count, with the recommendation that she should never be released. In his sentencing remarks, he stated, Rosemary Pauline West, on each of the 10 counts of murder of which you have been unanimously convicted by the jury, the sentence is one of life imprisonment. If attention is paid to what I think, you will never be released. Take her down. Public and media reaction. The case had gripped Britain throughout 1994 and 1995. The scale of the crimes, the duration over which they occurred, and the fact that they took place in a normal suburban house shocked the nation. Media coverage was intense and often sensationalistic. The phrase "House of Horrors" became synonymous with 25 Cromwell Street. Some critics argued that media focus on the sensational aspects distracted from serious questions about how the Wests had evaded detection for so long. Victims' families expressed relief at the verdict, but also profound grief that justice had come too late for their loved ones. Many criticized social services and police for missed opportunities to identify the abuse occurring at Cromwell Street. Aftermath. In October 1996, 25 Cromwell Street was demolished. Gloucester City Council decided the building had become too notorious to remain standing. The rubble was crushed and buried in a secret location to prevent souvenir hunters from taking pieces. The site was eventually turned into a public footpath. Rose West remains imprisoned at HM Prison Newhall in West Yorkshire. She has consistently maintained her innocence and has mounted several unsuccessful appeals. In 2004, the High Court confirmed that her sentence would remain a whole life tariff, meaning she will never be eligible for parole. Conclusion. The Fred and Rose West case remains one of the most horrifying criminal cases in British history. At least 12 young women and girls lost their lives to a couple whose evil was matched only by their ability to hide in plain sight. Impact on criminal justice. The case led to significant reforms in how British authorities handle child protection and missing persons cases. A multi-agency cooperation. The case highlighted failures in communication between police, social services, schools, and other agencies. New protocols were established requiring better information sharing. A missing persons investigations. The disappearance of Heather West and the failure to adequately investigate her whereabouts led to reforms in how police treat missing persons reports, particularly for vulnerable young people. Unanswered questions. Despite Fred's confessions and Rose's conviction, questions remain. Fred claimed to have committed murders before he met Rose, and spoke of other victims whose bodies were never found. The true number of victims may never be known. The case of Mary Bastholm, a 15-year-old girl who disappeared in Gloucester in 1968, has never been solved, and some investigators believe Fred West may have been responsible. In 2021, police excavated a cafe in Gloucester based on evidence that Mary might be buried there, but no remains were found. Final reflection. The Fred and Rose West case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for evil, the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members, and the failures of systems meant to protect them. It reminds us that horror can exist behind the most ordinary facades, and that vigilance, compassion, and institutional accountability are our only defenses against such predators. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every crime statistic, every true crime documentary, and every sensational headline are real human beings whose lives had value and meaning, and who deserved so much better than the fate they received. May they rest in peace.